Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Tuesday, April 29th, 2025 at 1:02 in the afternoon. So we're back again to have more discussions with our legislative council on CHIP program, which is an S-127. Hey, John.
Hello, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Happy to do whatever you guys want. Probably not that, but do you want me to screen share? That was the question I was.
Yeah, I think so. Herb we can talk about your suggestion.
Okay.
And then I also, maybe I did have some conversations with the treasurer, with the treasurer. Thoughts on the board, that whole thing too. So. John, do you have?
The few things.
Herbs.
I do have that.
I shortened it, John.
Okay.
Just the first two.
Okay, cool. Then I can screen share and talk about these if that's
Yeah, that would be great.
okay. So.
Want him to describe, or do you want me to explain it?
Okay, if you can.
Yeah, so
Right here.
describe it. I was thinking about our discussion last week, and we were, I think, struggling with the notion of what we hoped for from a program versus having provisions in the bill that might be a little too rigid to encompass a lot of different situations. And I had been thinking, but we really didn't have we did a lot last week, about an alternative means to try to accomplish some of this stuff without making it too rigid. And my thought was that a municipality makes some decisions. We were talking about, they're going to generally try to do what's right for the community, et cetera. But I was thinking about linking. So there's a section of the bill where the municipality shall do a bunch of stuff in terms of reviewing the application. And my thought was to link their decision to the purposes of the program, which is generally speaking to encourage the development of, make sure I get it right. It's 1907, and it is generally to encourage the development of primary residence for households of low or moderate income. So that was one piece. And then I was also thinking there was some discussion around what Pepsi should be doing. And I was thinking again to link their decision-making progress to furthering the purposes of, the program. That's the general thought.
Yep. So I take this to be a kind of general request to, in these two particular instances, add in a requirement that some thought is given to achieving the purpose of the program, basically, as set out in 1907, which again is that stimulate the development of primary residences for low to moderate income. And the two places that Representative Olson had proposed are first, Section 1908. This is your creation of the project and the housing development site. And so you could build in here into the creation of that project. You could, the language as stated here would drop a new subdivision 4 here to require determination that the housing infrastructure project furthers the purposes of Section 1907 of this title. You could alternatively get at the same thing by dropping it into the creation of the housing development plan up here. So the muni would create the project and site and develop this housing development plan, which would include, and it could include a determination that the proposed housing development would further the purposes of the chapter, something along those lines. The other instance would be in the actual application process, which is Section 1910. And Representative Olson has proposed including as the actual project criteria, including here that VEPC would review the application to determine this, in this case, to determine whether the project furthers the purposes of Section 1907 of this title. I would suggest that if you wanted to build it into the VEPC application process, you might consider if you had built it into that housing development plan, as discussed above, it could be picked up in the process requirements. right? Because the process requirements require a muni to have created this project and site pursuant to section 1908. And then you could have a little comma to say, including a determination that it meets the purposes of chapter 1907, something like that. So to me, those would be two places where you could plug in what Representative Olson is suggesting, but I also don't want to, I realize I proposed some tweaks and I don't want to misguide or misdirect Representative Olson's suggestions. Yeah.
I think either way of drafting would be fine.
And that would allow us to remove the,
It wouldn't remove anything. It would be adding something to both the municipal and Betsy process.
So adding a determination that it furthers the purposes of the subchapter, basically.
yeah, I mean, I'm perfectly fine with that. It'd be nice to be removing something out of it. But
And I'm thinking
I mean-
just bigger picture of, if there are folks who are concerned about the program, in terms of McMansions or whatever, second homes, that kind of thing, this might be a way to not insulate, but, show what our intentions are.
others? Thought? It's. But, I mean, it's not, if they wanted to do McMansions, we've talked a lot about this, it's not happening. But if they wanted to, it's not, this is not saying they can't.
Right. Yeah, so if you remember, we have testimony that some projects are designed to make sure you have enough income, I guess, to be able to subsidize other projects. And that was one of the problems I thought we had around having some rigid affordability guidelines, for example. And I think this would help deal with that issue. It would allow for the housing development to have a bunch of different types of housing, but if it furthers the low and moderate income, I think that would be, it would be another consideration for the municipality and Betsy to make sure that it really did further primary residence. And
I'm struggling with finding 1908B. Is this on page what of 3.1?
It would be on page 4 of draft 3.1.
Okay. Okay, so, all right, thank you.
No, I think it's
I have a question on how this would work. So if we put the language in the second instance of amendment, so having the council review
yeah.
the municipality, for me, that makes the most sense. So does that mean that when they make their determination, they would say how it does or how it doesn't? Or is that not how it
So-
would work in actuality?
So that would be if you're going that track of adding it to the project criteria, which is I think what you're talking about, that would be a more substantive check than just having the process check, right? Where you say, did the muni include in their housing development plan this particular piece? So it would depend on how you build it out, right? But if you are building it out as a project criteria, one of two that would have to be met, right? It would have to meet either this or this, plus you would have to meet this determination that it furthers the purpose. If you built that in as an independent project criterion, it would be an independent determination. It's not just a process check. It's Betsy has to say, we think that this furthers the purpose. And then it would be a question as to how much you want them to then provide, right? It could just be that internally they make that determination and they approve the application, but nothing goes out the door to substantiate that, right? Or you could say, we want, right? It'd be a policy question as to how much you want that to take. Do they need to publish something? Or is it literally like the other project criterion where they can look at the application, they make the determination, but they don't go out and say on this basis. But you could, if you wanted that, you can do it. You could have a sub 2 here or 1B. Betsy would review the project application to determine whether the project furthers the purposes of section 1907 and shall provide a written explanation of its decision. So you could do things like that. So there's options as to how you approach it. But just to go back to the basic question, yes, that would be a more substantive check requiring an independent VEPSI determination to have it in this project criterion. The thing I propose is more limited, but wouldn't have the same effect. It would just be a check to see, a process check to see whether it had been built into the housing development plan.
And to be clear, the way I drafted it originally was as a criterion.
Mhm.
There was a provision in the Senate bill that had a criterion, but it just said, I think something like
Includes housing.
housing. It needs to include housing. So the way I don't mind, however it's, folks want to draft it, but the way it's originally drafted sort of substituted for that Senate criteria.
But they are, I mean, it's a good point. They are meaningfully different. And my proposal to put it in the process was just a suggestion, not trying to override having it as an independent project criteria. I just, yeah. That is a more meaningful shift in what the program does, I guess, by point.
I'd like to include it in something.
I agree with her. Also shocking.
On that note, I'll jump on then.
Everybody good with including the language? John?
VEPSI still must do the same thing, or VEPSI no longer needs to determine that the housing infrastructure project furthers? I mean, I'm lost on how the process is strengthened with this.
It requires two new determinations. First, in section 1908B that
Yep.
you were talking about, it requires, as part of the housing development plan,
Right.
that the municipality include a determination that it meets the purposes of the subchapter. And then in 1910, the
Mhm.
actual VEPSI application process, under the project criteria, which is what sets out what VEPSI has to look
Right.
at, did you meet these standards?
Mhm.
You would add a new project criterion, which would be this determine whether the
Yeah.
project furthers the purposes of the subchapter. And the way that it would work for the criteria would be 1 and 2 are alternatives, right? Currently, you can meet this 40%, or you can meet this board determination. In any case, whether 1 or 2, you would have to meet this other piece, that BEPSI determined that it furthers the purposes of section 1907. I guess this raises the question whether you really only need it for 1. Because if you think about it, what 2 is asking is for the board to determine
Yeah.
whether this meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community. So it might be duplicative to have that same determination required for 2. So what you might do is have a D1 broken into sub A and sub B. So VEPSI would review that application to determine whether at least 40% is dedicated to housing and whether the project furthers the purposes of section 1907. So something like that, but just throwing out options.
At first blush, I thought, will the proposed amendment, the First Amendment, Representative Wilson proposed, be a box that's, an actual box that's checked? Is it a?
Yes, it's a thing that has to be done. And the way I was proposing it or tweaking it was that you would have under B1, this development of a housing development plan. This includes things like the sponsor, description of the project, the financing plan. One of the new items on this list, and you could have a new sub G, would be their determination that it does this. So it would be something they have to include in their housing development plan, which is part of what makes it available for VEPSI to then review.
I was trying to read and listen at the same time, and I failed to do either. So get that caught.
Whose Trump wins if the two decisions oppose each other? Conflict.
They would both have to be met. You'd have to meet both. So you'd have to have and the thing is that if the Muni didn't think it, they wouldn't submit it'd be useless for them to submit the application. So really it's going to be, if the Muni submits the application, the question will be, does VEPSI agree or have its own determination? At least that's the way that just hearing the idea that would make the most sense to me. Because the Muni wouldn't submit you wouldn't intentionally submit a defective application, right? Because that's not going to get through the door.
Sure, I understand, John. Where would you propose to put this language? Because I think it's important, for my purpose, it's important that it's under B somewhere, so
Exactly.
they shall.
Exactly. This would be, I was thinking, put it in B1. So it would be part of their housing development plan, which includes things like a description of the proposed housing development. Along with that description, could include their own determination that it does satisfy that.
That's the purpose, right? Okay.
On board with putting these pieces in. Okay. I had a conversation with the treasurer. About an hour ago, a little over an hour ago, and talked to him about the board, whether or not he is okay with that. He is. That for him it makes sense. He is okay with his office, him being chair in his office, supplying the administrative help. And I think if, we should set up somehow a time frame that, and if we set anything up, I think it needs to be known that, an application can still go forward if it doesn't meet the 60%. From the municipality, they can still provide that, to that, or 40%, I guess it is now, but that 40%, can still go to the Betsy board. That we know that Betsy will turn it down because it doesn't meet the 40%, but then it moves on to this new board.
Yep.
And so do we need language that supports that?
I mean, the criterion that makes clear that there are alternatives, I think it's maybe a separate question whether there needs to be, I know on Friday we were having a discussion about education broadly as to developers getting up to, and municipalities getting up to speed on how the program works. We don't yet have anything like an education type program built into the bill, and that might be something you could consider, and you could, but of course, the other thing is just this is going to trickle out, and Betsy and other folks have incentives to educate people as to how this works. So regardless of whether you put into legislative language those things, you could still achieve it. But it's not to say that you couldn't include, like a session law provision that you want to, like if you wanted to appropriate funds to set up some kind of education piece or something along those lines. But I don't think you have to do anything to make that happen. The criteria say it's this, or if it's determined that it's not that, then Betsy can reach out to the board. But people will need to understand. Hopefully they'll just listen to all my testimony and it'll all be good.
A clarifying question then, I'm sorry if you already addressed this. With that second amendment that's being proposed,
Mhm.
if NEPC determines that the project does not meet at least 40%, and therefore the chip board needs to determine what they need to determine, does NEPC still need to determine whether the project furthers the purposes of 1907 of this type?
They do not. That was the last piece we were just, no, you're good. You're good. Because the thinking there was that it's duplicative of that analysis, right? If they're having to make an affirmative determination about what the housing achieves, then maybe less reason to ask them also but naturally they should look to the purposes to, yeah.
Okay. And then, we should create, turnaround period where Betsy, would send this on to the board. So, thinking that once Betsy has, moved this on to the board, that within 30 days, they should make a determination.
When project, if they get rejected for the first instance, when it moves on to the board, like, would that just be an automatic trigger? Like, this project got rejected, it gets reviewed by the board?
What we should think, and I think it probably should, like, yeah, we don't want. If we don't, then it would be up to the sponsor or the municipality to then appeal to. But I think it should be automatic.
Yeah, I agree.
You would think municipalities aren't sending projects along that they don't.
Right, yeah.
They don't think are important.
right.
Okay.
I had a question, clarify on page 8 and 9, Jenna.
Okay.
And in the bottom of 8, talks about located, it's basically location criteria. Provided that housing development for which all permits
Yes.
required pursuant to Act 250 have been secured shall be deemed to satisfy the location. Okay. And I'm reading that to mean that if you have all the permits required under Act 250, if you don't need an Act 250.
I think that is a fair reading of the language, right? If there's nothing required, then you have all the permits required, which are none.
Thank you.
But let's go piggyback on that. So then is the implication that it would bypass the affordability criteria in the purpose of 1907?
So this would not affect that determination because this is just speaking exclusively to the location criteria. So what this says is you're deemed to have met the location criteria if you have the Act 250 permits that are required for your project. You still have to meet the other conditions of the section, which include that determination as we were discussing. Yeah. And if I'm not looking at you guys, it's because I'm trying to put these things into draft 4.1. Is why that's good. So that maybe I can have something in like 2 minutes.
When do you have to leave, John?
I gotta be out of here. I need to be in Senate Appropriations at 1:30.
And do you know what time you'll be available to come back? Yeah.
I am in ed from 2 to 3 and then corrections from 3 to 4, but as discussed, I may be done in corrections across the hall sooner than 4. Like I wouldn't expect it's gonna take an hour to do it. It could be 30 minutes.
Is it with respect to, we're just looking, page 8, line 17, location criteria. Provided that housing developments, how often do the housing developments have all their permits in hand? Is that a reasonable expectation?
Just to be clear, it is an alternative route. It is not something
It's
that
not a
everyone needs.
requirement.
In any case, a project will need to meet its required
Yeah.
permitting. What this says is it's timing, right? If you happen to have them all in hand at the time of your application, you don't need to meet the location criteria. It's basically the effect. If you don't, you can make the application and you can still secure your permits.
And maybe this is a really good thing to have in there for projects that are like today existing.
Exactly.
And could be okay,
That's the way that I understand it. Yeah.
great. That makes sense to me. All right, thank you. And then I appreciate the clarification.
Can I screen share? I haven't sent this to Anna Grace, but can I screen share what I'm doing right now? So maybe you can see if this is capturing the set of requests. And then I will run. Okay. Can you see this okay? So I'll scroll back down to that, but what you see in section 1908, this was Representative Olson's proposal. I was including in B1, as discussed, a new subdivision G. Determination that the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907 of this subchapter. I can scroll up to 1907 if you guys would like to see that, but this would be included as part of that housing development plan that's submitted. And the purpose is right here. That's section 1907. The other instance related to this is in 1910, your application. Your project criteria. So now you have a broken out subdivision 1. Recall that 1 and 2 are alternatives. 2 is your board determination. So this is saying that just for 1, Betsy would review the infrastructure project application to determine whether at least, and there've been some discussions about a 60% figure. I know we've been vacillating. I have whatever you guys come out with, there's 60% here to determine whether at least the specified percentage is dedicated to housing, and the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907 of this title. You could build it in there, and it would have to be picked up anytime someone is pursuing this route under 1. You wouldn't require that same determination under 2 because the board is making a determination about projected housing development meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community. I may have some last other things here, and then I do have to go. All right, for the whiplash, I know that I have something. Probably at the board section. Yes. So we're at the duties of the board, page 21, 1910G. So upon request, the board makes this determination, and we've included language to say the board shall respond with this determination no later than 30 days following receipt of that request from Betsy. And then down here, I have deleted the bracketed language related to being housed with the treasurer. So treasurer is now called out as chair of the board, and similarly for administrative assistants, no more brackets. It just references the treasurer.
Didn't you want some provision that it be approved unless acted on? No, finish. Come on.
Or the,
I do have to run, but I'll hear what you guys have. And feel free to email if
We'll be hearing from Samantha from VLCT, and then Laura's gonna get on with us at 2:00 as well. So,
good.
and when you come back, we should have, if there's any more edits, we should be the final one.
Right.
Thank you, John.
See you soon.
Great. Josh is gonna.
Okay, sure.
That's okay.
Was chair.
Yeah,
that's fine.
I'll lean forward.
You have the.
Executive director got me.
That's right.
Thanks for having us in real quick. For the record, Josh Hanford, Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
Samantha Sheehan, also from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. I feel so much. Does this go down?
It's okay.
It's okay. Does it make me seem like more impressive? Okay.
I think we wanted to chat with you about some new elements added to this, particularly subsection 1909 A4, which is the provision that would provide terms to ensure that any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively as primary residence throughout the life of the housing development and site. And, we're here to talk about, in principle, we absolutely agree with this as a purpose and as a goal, as it's stated out earlier on in the purpose, but think there's some pretty significant unintended consequences of this language. And we just wanted to talk to you about those and our feelings about it. You want to start? And then I'll fill in with details as we go.
Yeah, so first, it is a goal of VLCT members, of town officials across the state, to add new regulatory tools to control against future proliferation of short-term rentals. That's something we came into the session with. It's on our priority sheet. We, for a moment, had it in the House's own housing omnibus bill. It was removed from a version of a draft prior to going to the House floor. But we do not believe that the best place to regulate against short-term rentals within new housing development is within the CHIP program. We think that municipalities would benefit from other tools that would expand the sort of levers of local government so that they can address issues and impacts on a community related to short-term rentals and second homes broadly, not just in a CHIP project and not just for the public infrastructure expense related to a single housing project. So I guess that's first. Then we'd like to sort of talk about why, if you were to include that in the CHIP, the place to do it, we feel, is not within the housing infrastructure agreement. And then lastly, what the consequences of doing that could be. So the housing infrastructure agreement is required to create the CHIP and receive VEPC approval, but it is an agreement between the municipality and the developer and potentially a third-party sponsor, financial sponsor, that true purpose goes well beyond the process of VEPC approval. The development agreement protects the municipal interest, and in doing so, protects the interest of our shared constituents, who are the Vermonters, the voters, the taxpayers, the ratepayers of a given municipality. The development agreement will have a number of provisions that go well beyond the few that are enumerated and required for the purpose of VEPC approval. Development agreements exist now in every example of public-private partnership for housing development. By adding a sort of reaching policy goal that would create so let me take a step back. A good development agreement is a strong and explicit contract that is enforceable for every party that is subject to the agreement or party to the agreement. So we want the development agreement that goes to VEPC for approval to be a really effective contract that helps protect the interest of taxpayers and ratepayers within the municipality, as well as produces the goal of the agreement, which is the housing development. If there are provisions which are unenforceable by one of the parties of the contract, then it may not serve that purpose ultimately. And is everyone following me? So if we add things to the development agreement that one party or the other or both is unlikely to call the question on, they're not going to sue the party to get what they need out of the contract because there's stuff in there that they can't live up to themselves, then the development agreement may not be serving its true purpose, which is to protect the public interest of taxpayers.
I'll reply. I fully understand what you're saying. I'm not sure what you're specifically referring to that wouldn't be.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for prompting that. We are explicitly discussing 4, which is terms to ensure that any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively as a primary residence throughout the life of the development housing site.
So let me expand here a little bit. We believe the only way to enforce that would be to pass on a housing covenant to the developer, that the developer would have to enforce in good faith, and maybe a municipality would have to call them on that if they notice people were living there for half the year. You take that further, what does that mean the municipality's actions or enforcements are? Further, covenants like that are common practice when you provide housing subsidy. That is the common practice for nonprofit, permanently affordable housing and shared equity programs. The fear here is that let's take a homeownership development that's developed with CHIP. Let's take, for example, Representative Marcotte, the Sacred Heart property in Newport. Rural Edge is developing the first part, the condos. There's a second part that's going to be market rate single family homes. A developer that would sign this agreement, first, we think there'd be very few because it's limiting their market of who they can sell it to, requiring them to follow the ownership of that. Let's just say the first person buys it is a Vermont permanent resident, right? They buy it, they get a market, they build it tomorrow. Let's say in 10 years, that homeowner needs to sell the home and move. Well, when they go to sell it, their market for that new person that's going to get a mortgage is now reduced by only a Vermont resident. That's now going to make who they could sell it to probably erase their equity if it's a tough financial time. You're limiting the development potential and the future equity of the homeowners by saying you have this permanent residency requirement. We agree with the goal, but this could kill the deal. In our estimation, only make it available for those shared equity homes or permanently affordable housing to take advantage of this, because the encumbrance on your property, the new person that's going to get a mortgage, going to have a harder time finding someone to purchase that and have this income residency restriction on it for 20, 30 years, it could have consequences here that I think are unintended. And we would support some other way to find this. Typically, as I said, all of the programs, whether they're low-income housing tax credit programs that Maura Collins administers, VHCB, Home Loan Bank from Boston, federal funds, AMP, the Housing Trust Fund, those all come with subsidy that requires covenants for permanent affordability and permanent residency, but it's attached to a nonprofit developer that owns that property, manages it, monitors it in perpetuity, or for at least 30 years. In some of the cases, this would exclude private developers from accessing this program, particularly on home ownership development, because they can't control the future buyers, and those future buyers and the existing people that buy the homes that try to sell it would be encumbered by this and have a smaller, slimmer market to sell it to and to access the mortgage market.
So by eliminating, by control, so what you're doing is you're sort of regulating the use, but you're affecting the market of who can use that property, which for the purpose of homeownership will almost definitely jeopardize the ability of a home buyer to access conventional financing, so a conventional mortgage. In the case of,
I think we understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think I question some of your premises, actually.
I'd
I
love
think
to
that-
hear
Yeah,
that.
'cause what
Yeah.
you're saying is it has to be a Vermont resident. It doesn't have to be a Vermont.
It says
resident.
primary.
Primary housing, so somebody can own it and rent it full-time, right? And that would be used for primary residence, right? We have covenants, many of us live in homeowners association that have covenants that are without subsidies, this is real subsidy that the state is providing, right, in the CHIP program. So that makes sense, right? Based on
Yeah.
everything that you're saying, it makes sense that there could be regulations around what is built there.
But the duty to create and enforce those regulations by placing this in the requirement of the development agreement would fall on the municipality.
It's
Not.
a contract.
It's a contract. It would
The
follow.
municipality would have to figure out.
I think
But the contract is between the developer and the municipality. So either the municipality enforces or,
Well, the municipality could also say in a contract that the developer or the sponsor is attesting to that they're providing primary residence.
Okay, if I
another
could-
example
if I
about a
could-
senior housing,
well,
Or
I
that would
heard,
be a challenge.
yeah,
Senior
sorry.
housing, that someone maybe is only occupying it for less than, maybe they're only occupying it for 4 or 5 months of the year. That's a need that frees up housing, student housing. I think there's consequences around this language that would limit a lot of projects.
And in the, we've talked a lot about units intended, developed but intended to be purchased for homeownership. In rental, whoever the landlord is, the buyer of the project, the developer of the CHIP project, somebody else in time that buys the units. But for rentals, in theory, that could be done through municipal ordinance. So the municipality could create ordinance that requires it be a primary residence in that rental unit. But that would require local resources that the vast majority of Vermont municipalities don't have for rental regulation and code enforcement.
Yeah, I still think you're making assumptions that aren't necessarily in most of these situations. And I think one of those assumptions is that this program should be used for every single program that's built in the state, right? There should be restrictions on how we use our public dollars. We should be placing guardrails around. That's where we're starting from. And one of those guardrails is we want there to be primary residences built through these programs. That's very important right now in the state that needs more primary residents, right? And a municipality does not have to enforce that. If it's a covenant, if it's a agreement that is signed, then it can be civil penalties against that. So there are many ways to enforce this. So again, I think that if there are covenants in a development, then whoever chooses to own is required to follow those covenants. They sign an agreement. So then they are responsible for upholding it. It's no longer the municipality's responsibility.
If the enforcement happens through a covenant, if that covenant is attached to the development, the housing development site by the developer, certainly that could affect the ability of that future owner, whether it's the same developer for 20 years or it's a home buyer, to access conventional financing. That's not
Question.
a
I think
question.
there's developers that you haven't heard from, that this is new, that maybe would shed some light about how this could limit the deals, the development deals they'll undertake, the financing they can access. I have agreed entirely with the premises that we want to support primary residents here. And when we assign subsidies into the housing development with owners, they do that. They do that very well. Those covenants work. Been involved in many of them. This is a different sort of contract and development agreement with the infrastructure that is, maybe the best way to describe it is, in good faith, someone's going to follow this and check up on it. And if someone defines that they're not following this, then it's the municipality to call the question, and to what else in the development agreement is not, maybe not being followed.
Like timeline to construction, the responsibility to acquire the debt, the date the debt will be transferred, the deadline that the developer has to acquire permits and in what order. The development agreement will be extensive, and it will protect the public interest in every way that the municipality is able to negotiate that in. But so we talked about how a covenant could affect conventional financing for the current or future owner of the development site. I want to say, if you're proposing that the municipality simply require that the developer be the one in charge of ensuring renters are renting for a primary residence, I would ask, how would a nonprofit or corporation fulfill that responsibility? Like they do not, the homestead filing is delivered to the state, not the municipality, not the landlord. So
You have an
I think there's a feasibility problem with the developer, the landlord, the property manager, a non-governmental entity, sort of administering this purpose of primary residency. And Maura spoke to that in her first sort of round of testimony as well. This is a type of use that is based on what? Between which month to what month did the person live, how many days per what increment of time in that unit? And how does the enforcing party, or the party responsible under the development agreement with the municipality, know that information? Because they're not a lister, they're not a zoning administrator, they're not an employee of the State Department of Taxes.
So the question is a covenant that is the agreement for that development enough to meet this?
Is a covenant enough to identify whether someone is a primary?
Yes, to ensure, right? If there's a covenant on the property that says this is for primary residence, does that meet this requirement?
I don't see. I guess I'm confused, like, who has a right of action? So if a renter, homeowner, developer, landlord, property manager, fiscal sponsor, or municipality violates this provision of the development agreement contract, who has the right of action if not the municipality? Is my question. Like,
I mean, I get your point. Two things. The way I understand covenants work, not a real estate lawyer, but there's something that's put into the land records of the municipality. And so if you're going to have sale, Tony's going to know more about this. But if you're going to have a sale, you're typically going to get a an attorney to look over and make sure you got clean title. And if this comes out, you know, if you got a covenant, they're gonna advise their client. I suppose they could say, I'll buy it anyway, but it certainly is a flag. And I think that's the way it happens as opposed to municipality, you know, taking some affirmative action, just by operation of the sales. The other issue that I mean, what you said gives you pause for sure. On the other hand, I think folks have an understandable desire to, you know, frame the program in a manner that furthers the purposes of the program as identified in 1907. And part of me says that those requirements, both for Betsy and for the municipality, that, you know, we're talking about including in their requirements, is going to satisfy a lot of what's in here. But the two things that you mentioned that did give me pause was you said that this provision would exclude private developers and preclude conventional financing.
Mhm.
And I'm not quite understanding that. And I think that's a big deal. Can you explain maybe a little bit more why that would happen? I don't fully understand.
So I don't think this is unique to the concept of primary residency. This is a potential outcome of any type of land covenant. If you're a buyer going to buy a property and you would like to have an orchard someday, you will make sure in the process of buying that property that there is no covenant or local land use regulation or state land use regulation that would prevent you from planting an orchard. We are making an assumption, although I think it's a very, very safe assumption, that many buyers and lenders would be seriously concerned that the property they're looking at buying, being a chip built project, could only be occupied by a primary resident. What if their own personal life circumstance changes? They're deployed, their spouse is deployed, they decide to go to grad school out of state, they work for Tetra Tech, they retire and start spending a significant part of the year out of state or within another Vermont community. And then they have violated the covenant on the property that they purchased. Or when they go then to sell the property and hopefully realize equity, personal equity to cash in on this very important personal asset that they've invested so much into, that they rather than going to the best bid, they have to go to the best bid that can prove it's a primary resident of the state of Vermont.
No, I get it. But in my mind, that's a matter of degree, right? You know, in terms of where you're getting, you know, the equity value.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. A matter of what?
Degree.
Degree?
And I thought I heard you said, you know, it concludes, you know.
It'll have an impact. I believe it'll have an impact on both of those.
Right, as opposed to precluding or preventing a product. It might be a matter of degree.
I think there's developers that will see their market shrink. And there will be homeowners that look at this and look at the mortgage and say, this works for me, but what happens if I run into a pickle in 10 years, I need to move, maybe the market isn't as hot. I now can't, maybe there was someone I can sell it to, but they're not planning on this being their primary residence. And so I'm going to have to wait and go and miss my mortgage payments and going to, like, I think there's unintended consequences. That's why we have affordable housing development programs, funding, shared equity homes that do this very thing. And they provide subsidy into those homes and into those rental units, and they monitor it and they oversee those, and those programs aren't going away and they exist. And those programs will be part of building this housing. But to have this in the development agreement to build the infrastructure could give pause for some developers. And we think more often it would be the private developers. And we think more often it would be the homeownership units that would potentially be slowed by this effort. which we support the primary residence, we just don't think this is the right tool.
Well,
I guess I was gonna ask what tool would be the right tool to infer primary residency?
Within the CHIP program? I mean, for us, we advocate for that tool to exist broadly for all types of housing, existing housing stock, future developments that are not CHIP projects, as well as potential CHIP projects. Our members are broadly concerned about the local level impacts on the housing market, but on other parts of the community, like their ability to put up a safe fire life safety response at the local level, the impacts on their local wastewater and sewer systems that short-term rentals, the proliferation of the short-term rental market has. So sort of first, we advocate broadly for better regulation at the local level to answer those local impacts, not just within the CHIP program. I think within the CHIP program, I think you've already done it in the purpose. And it sounds like when we entered the room, there was a discussion to sort of enhance the requirement to prove that a proposed housing development meets the purpose of the program. The purpose already says that this advances housing that is affordable and for primary residents. If that's the intent of the development, the developer can prove that to the municipality can prove that to VEPSI, and then VEPSI reports that information to you. We think that's satisfactory. And so we think it's inappropriate within the development agreement unless you expect the municipality to fulfill a duty to enforce. We think there's potentially serious unintended consequences for the uptake of the program by putting it in the development agreement. We think there's potentially unintended adverse consequences on the homeowners and renters who may be able to realize housing through this program. And we think you've done it already in the purpose. To sort of summarize our position.
So I hear the concern is throughout the life of the housing development. Correct? It's throughout the life of the house.
The concern is that it's obligated within the development agreement. The development agreement is a contract between.
So the whole portion of that section. So you wouldn't want to provide terms to ensure any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively as a primary resident.
We would not want any requirement in the development agreement that a municipality cannot ensure
And enforce.
and enforce. If that helps. The development agreement is signed and executed and enforceable to the municipality. So we don't want any requirement in there that a municipality does not have the existing authority, resources, desire, ability, and perpetuity, and certainly for the life of a housing development site to act on. That's the heart of the rub. We don't disagree with the goal, like the policy direction. We certainly have worked hard to advance this legislation to where it is at this point in the building to realize the development of desperately needed permanent year-round housing of all types in all Vermont communities. We support the effort that you're trying to get to here. We cannot support it being obligated to the municipality through the requirement to be in the development agreement.
Yes.
You believe that ensuring that something is offered is the same as ensuring that something is used?
Can you say that a different way?
Any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively as a primary residence? Is that the same as being used?
Not,
exclusively?
well, if you add the word exclusively, it becomes the same thing, right?
Is offering and use are the same thing?
If you add if you enhance it with exclusively, Right, I can offer you vanilla and chocolate ice cream, or I can offer you exclusively chocolate ice cream. Now you have lost the choice.
Mhm.
The buyer, the seller, the renter, has lost the choice of use of yeah.
And then the other question I have is, do you feel like as written, this is legal?
Well, that's a
being
great
challenged in
question
Supreme Court
because
right now,
we
yeah.
actually feel that it is legal for municipalities to regulate the use of property for a variety of uses. The city of Burlington, in an attempt specifically to end the proliferation of short-term rentals that were putting pressure on the affordable rental market in the city of Burlington, created a pretty robust short-term rental ordinance that in part required the short-term rental be on the same housing site as the primary residence of the homeowner or the short-term rental lister. And that has been challenged by 11 short-term rental property owners who have, and it is before the Supreme Court and undecided. Yeah.
Do you feel that the way it's been written ought to be seen as that's a legitimate use of political, like police powers, that is what they're doing is.
It's the position of VLCT that municipalities can regulate land use. Yeah.
The comment that the last comment that's actually, you said that a lot of municipalities don't have the capacity to perhaps address this through ordinances or what have you. Is that part of the self-selection process of CHIP, or is that something that in the time that it takes to work up a project that can be part of the pregame activity?
But you're saying for the life of the development agreement.
And
So for
yeah.
20 years, the municipality, or for the life of the debt, up to 20 years, the municipality has to
You're not
ensure
referring to table
this.
setting, you're referring to after action.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure a lot of municipal attorneys would say, think twice about this.
Okay.
You're going to sign a development agreement. You're signing that you're going to enforce this. How are you going to enforce it? What happens if you know half those cards are gone all winter because they're in Florida? Are you going to shut down the project? I mean, this doesn't seem offensive. It seems policy wise, but the reality is I think there's going to be some municipalities that this by itself will be enough to give them pause whether they want to take this responsibility on and whether they can enforce it. Even if they share the goal that they would like to have permanent people living in all the housing that's built in the
Which
town.
is, we don't even have to say if, that is a goal that unanimously our members advanced that legislative priority. It is absolutely the goal of town officials across the state to realize year-round, affordable, accessible housing.
VHFA has a first-time home buyer, grant. They give a grant. You have to be a resident. Those are subsidies that ensure this happens, that we have several of, maybe we need more, but there's a condition that's monitored, that's required, that when someone gets in this housing, they've taken a first-time home buyer assistance, they've taken a rental subsidy, they've taken a development subsidy into the home, and it is monitored. There's compliance checks by the nonprofit developers that are using those funds, and there's reporting requirements on people that take the first-time home buyer, first-generation home buyer funds so that they don't abuse this. It's just another step to say this infrastructure that's going to allow this housing, that municipality needs to make sure everyone there is a primary resident for the next 20, 30 years, that we think is going to slow, if nothing else, the uptick of this for some communities that are hesitant to take on that responsibility.
Would your position on this subdivision 4 change if you remove that last phrase in subdivision 4? In other words, the words throughout the life of the housing development site?
The initial offering.
Right.
So it would
Perhaps
say-
that would be easier if you have the right
Provide-
developer.
So provide terms to ensure any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively. I think if you dropped life and exclusively, then that would, and I am not a lawyer, but I think that together would meaningfully address the heart of our concern. Yeah.
I guess what I'm struggling with is like any attempt to control STRs is going to bring a massive shift to the market, which is also going to likely deter some potential buyers, right?
What market? The short-term rental market, the housing
The
market,
housing
the rental market?
The housing market at large, right? Because part of what drives the short-term rental market is the ability to, buy and sell property that can be used for that purpose. So I think any attempt, which is what also the municipalities are asking for, is going to shrink the buying pool if we're changing our real estate market to shift away from the dominance of short-term rentals.
I don't know if I can agree with that assumption, given the broad and overwhelming demand within the market for all types of housing and all types of uses of residential units. It's not like the lion's share of the buyer's market is looking for investment property. There are buyers of all backgrounds in every community across the state, of all ages, of all income levels, looking for housing to live in. There is no shortage of people looking to buy a home for them to live in.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's what we're trying to do here, is to ensure that we have enough permanent housing stock to make sure that those houses are available.
So I get the challenge with the definition of primary residence for sure. Students, seniors, right, people are deployed. I get that. But what about if the terms ensure that it would not become a short-term rental? And I think that if we separate those sort of two, I feel like those are two different issues.
Yeah, I guess I wish Ledge Council was in the room because I forget right now if state law defines short-term rental. Does it?
Well, it's for more than 14 days a year, with none of the stays more than 30 days. There is a definition for short-term rental. But the housing stock that short-term rental occupies is less than 2% of the housing stock. And of that, I think VHFA's dashboard that has short-term rental data to sort of have a real-time understanding of what's happening community by community. Also, a number of those short-term rentals are in second homes that use short-term rentals, and that the market rapidly changes. My town, Randolph, just got its first hotel between exit 1 and exit 7. If you look at the last 3 months that hotel's been open, short-term rentals have dropped substantially because there was no place for visiting to stay. And so that market will fluctuate. And the folks will go in and out of a long-term rental and short-term rental on their property. And if someone left their home and wanted to rent it short-term, they couldn't do that. Maybe they're on a traveling nurse assignment across the country and meet this. I think that there are.
Why would they meet this?
Because they're not their primary
They're
residence.
not living in it.
They're not
They
living
still
in it.
let
Rent it out to another person, and they can
Yeah, but
also be a.
That would
But they
create
couldn't rent it to a
short-term
short-term rental.
That would create a short-term rental.
They-
And that would change the use of the property.
What's the definition of a short?
short-term rental.
It's 30 days.
30 days.
It's a furnished house, condominium, or other dwelling room or self-contained dwelling unit rented to the transient, traveling, or vacationing public for a period of fewer than 30 consecutive days and for more than 14 days per calendar year. So there's
Traveling nurses.
But if I went to take care of my family in Rhode Island for the summer and rented my home for
2 short-term rental.
35
to pay the bills
days,
while I'm gone.
yeah, for 35 days
violation.
to a traveling nurse at Porter, I would have created a short-term rental and I would have changed the use of my property.
You're still
For
paying to get
35
as a
days.
primary residence.
I mean, I guess this raises this kind of gets to the heart of the problem. How does the municipality or whomever you envision should be enforcing this provision within the development agreement decide this and determine if it's being met? That's just fundamentally our concern. And we say to you that the vast majority of municipalities do not have the tools and resources to meet this provision of the development agreement. that would be required of them.
Anything else? That's it.
Yep.
Last question.
No, I mean, it's more of a statement. I think the problem would be taken care of if we remove throughout the life of the housing development. And I would be supportive of that.
I heard them say that,
We can talk about.
Yeah, we'll
language
talk
when
about
we
that.
have legislative council.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for hearing us. I know
Yep.
it's adding challenges to the shared goal.
Before I leave the record, I just want to say I am just thrilled that we're at this level of minutia for this program. I think that's a really exciting sign of how close we are to realizing a totally transformative proposal. And we really appreciate and support the work that you're doing to get it right.
Laura, are you listening in? Hello.
Always listening.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm Maura Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. And thank you for letting me go after really smart people like Josh and Samantha so that it makes my testimony easier. You'll notice earlier today I sent a memo to the committee, and so I believe Anna Grace has already put it up on your committee's website. I've already been here testifying in support of the CHIP proposal in S127. Like you just heard, I am like you just heard from the league, very supportive of what is happening and developing with CHIP. I have not listened to a lot of the testimony, but I have been briefed on some of the testimony you've heard, and I got a little worried when I started hearing that this housing program was going to not have potentially the risk that not have the majority of the square footage that would benefit from this infrastructure investment be homes. And so that's what prompted my memo today. I have heard you all looking at the idea of what's the percentage of square footage that should be housing. And like I testified last time, I really support that being the majority of what gets this benefit. So the majority of it should be housing. I don't think it needs to be exclusively housing because we know that vibrant and well-designed downtowns do require a mix of housing and commercial spaces. I don't want to preclude a downtown area from having that first floor retail that makes the walking by on the streetscape more appealing and enjoyable. But I do think that if you were to consider a percentage that's less than 60%, then I'm far less excited by this proposal. Why I'm excited about this is that this is a resource to support housing development. And I know I don't have to tell this committee specifically about the needs of housing, but it has well documented how much we need housing. And I don't see the same documentation about Vermont having the same kind of shortage or crisis of vacant commercial space and that we need more commercial space. I think we do need commercial space. Communities do need that because, like I said, that's what a well-designed downtown requires. But I'm not hearing about a lack of commercial space being what is holding back our economy. That's not what the treasurer has been saying is holding back our credit ratings. That's not what employers are asking for and clamoring for. And so I strongly want to be on the record as saying that it should be at least 60% of the floor area of the development that benefits from CHIP should be housing. I also am aware that there's the CHIP board and that this board could consider if VEPC doesn't find that a development meets that threshold, that the ultimate decision could be made by a CHIP board. I do like that there would be strong housing-focused organizations on that board. I would be happy to have VHFA be a part of that. I think that that is important to have strong housing representation there. I also have heard some criticism about, well, if you go through the whole municipal process and then it gets to the VEPSI board and then VEPSI doesn't approve it and then it gets kicked over to a CHIP board, how bureaucratic and how much delays may be in place. So I don't know if you'd want to consider putting some kind of.
Uh-oh,
You're silent.
we lost you.
What, you,
Oh, you're there. Oh,
I don't know how many was the last
we
thing.
can hear you now.
Okay. I thank you. Burlington has been having electrical and internet issues all day, if you haven't heard. So I don't know exactly what my sentence was, but it was that I don't want to create inefficiencies by with this chip board. And so if the bill wanted to consider adding in some kind of expectation of a maximum turnaround time for a decision of 30, 45 days, something that you all felt instilled the urgency that time is money, but still was realistic for a decision to be kicked over to the chip board, make a decision and take action before moving forward. I think that would be a nice way to build in a further review and discussion of this without adding too much time. I have also heard about the discussions about how to support and promote affordable housing. And so in my memo, I reiterated that there are many ways you all could support affordable housing through this. I have been consistent in all my testimony in all the committees. How you make housing affordable is through subsidy. And I've said it to this committee as well. To make housing cheaper, you have to have some money in it. And so if that looked like the CHIP proposal allowing traditional government-supported affordable housing to retain a larger increment of the tax savings, that's one way of putting money in to make the housing more affordable. You could consider studying for future use, looking at if maybe not just infrastructure is an eligible investment, but maybe housing affordability for low-income households. Long-term affordability could be another way that this proposal could be studied for the future to expand. And then I'll keep pointing to a report that came out that there was a whole report on how to incentivize affordable housing. So the last point, I'll just build off of the tail end of what I heard that the league was just testifying on, and that is in support of this program being for primary residences. That is important. I think that everyone is in agreement that this CHIP program should support primary residences. And as the league pointed out, there are some real administrative hurdles to do that. And so I really liked what I heard at the end and would support the idea of crossing out throughout the life of the housing development site, because it's that throughout the life of that I struggle to see how you could make it work. For one thing, and I'm sorry that I joined the league's testimony late, so maybe they already said this, but I'm hoping a lot of these homes are owned homes and that this continues Vermont's high predominance of homeownership. Once a home is sold, there is no way to control the use of that home unless you have a deed covenant underlying the land. And if you have some kind of covenant or deed restricting the use of that property to a primary residence, you have filing and recording fees. You have someone who has to monitor and administer this. You may involve the secondary market and the mortgageability of that property, and it gets really complicated really quickly. And so I do think that there's a way that you can put in the intent of this bill, that this is for primary residences, so that the municipalities are clear that that's what they should be asking about and having conversations with developers about. I think that the VEPC board should be clear that what they are approving is for primary residences, as well as the CHIP board. I also think that the reporting back every year is going to help so that we can have a log of all the housing that has been created here. But to go further at this point and to require that for the life of the property, it's limited to primary residences, will probably require some appropriations for some state agency to administer and monitor this. Or it's an unfunded mandate to the municipalities, which is, I think, what you were just hearing. And it may limit this to deed restricted homes otherwise.
Thanks very much, Mark. So you were talking about hoping for some type of 60% floor area as showing your intent, we want homes here. And then you also were talking about the board. Is it your understanding that the board would be able to make a modification to that 60% based on their feeling that the project still, even if it didn't meet the 60%, was still meeting the housing needs of the community or not?
That was my understanding of what you all were trying to do with the creation of that board. And I will say, the board's not even created, and if VHFA were on it, I can show you how we'd show up on it, which would be to be a real critical voice. Why should we allow a CHIP proposal to go forward if it can't at least promise 60% of the floor area to be housing? But there are times, knowing how phased development works, that maybe even I could be convinced that in phase one, the proportion may be just short of 60%, but that there are future phases where that proportion would be far greater. That would be the kind of example where I can see why you would kick this to a board and look for some sort of approval because of the reality of phase development.
Yes, and I was thinking of another example where you might want some flexibility. I'm thinking of a town that they used to have a country store, right? They don't have anymore, but they still have a building, and they might want to try to figure out how to get that store back for a lot of good reasons and create housing above it. You might not make the 60% just physically.
Mm-hmm.
Does that fit with your concept of this?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maura. With my question is about that CHIP board. Is it possible that that could be meeting in conjunction with VEPC if the go, no go for the CHIP board's involvement is that 40% or that 60%, that quick assessment? Like, do you envision this being something that would need a lot of time, or is this something that in your mind that could be within a month's period of time, you'd be able to just meet with VEPC and with the applicants all at once?
I'd love to think that it would be that smooth and easy. I'd love to think that the CHIP board is not used all that much. I'd like to think that the gross majority of these approvals are well over the 60% test, and the CHIP board is only called into question rarely. But yes, could it all happen at the same time, smoothly and easily? Please, that's good government. Let's do more of that.
I think that could be something that's developed between VEPC and the CHIP board to make those determinations on how they could do this.
I'm sorry to ask you a question about your bill in front of you, but you haven't named the leader of the CHIP board, is that correct?
It will be the treasurer.
Okay,
And the treasurer's office will provide the administrative.
okay.
I spoke with
Oh,
the
I
treasurer.
see that now. Service chair of the board. Thank you.
Yeah. Tony?
So I'm curious, why you favor a CHIP board versus just giving VEPC additional guidance to deal with it on their own?
Because I think that defining all the guidance, if we knew that guidance, we'd have written it already. I don't know what, I thought this was about those unforeseen circumstances, like an unusually phased project or something like that, where it would be hard to define in statute right now. But to my understanding, what is in draft 3.1 that I'm looking at is everything we're envisioning is going to happen right now. And this is for those unforeseen situations that we can't imagine that needs further review.
The questions for Maura? Maura, thank you. We're talking about primary residences and I think everyone's on the same page. That's what we're looking for. And if some projects if we start seeing investors purchasing properties, that it could shut the CHIP program down real quick. And so I think everybody has to have that in the back of their mind, that as we go forward, municipalities, VEPC, developers, sponsors, all have to have that in the back of their mind as well, that we could lose the program really quick if the legislature starts seeing that happening.
And I agree with you. I also want to say that what I've heard from this committee and others is that you all want to support affordable housing. And I think there are a lot of ways you can do that outside of the CHIP proposal. I think you want to support the limits of short-term rentals. And I think there's ways the legislature can do that outside of the CHIP proposal. I think that there are ways we can be encouraging smart growth and good development in our downtowns and all that outside of the CHIP proposal. And so I agree with you that any kind of use of the CHIP program that goes beyond the intention of what we're envisioning today could be a threat to the entire CHIP program. I also want to make sure that we remember that we have other public policy tools to get at protecting Vermont from some of these negative consequences, like short-term rentals being one of the only from taking over a town, or that there's not enough affordable housing in a community. There's other things the legislature can and should be doing to push for those things.
Agreed. Okay. Maura, thank you. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So I guess 2 questions for us is the committee comfortable with striking part of that, the primary residency? So it's not for the life of the project.
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
And maybe also that word exclusively, that's a little ambiguous too, I think. When I framed the question to VLCT, I think that's what they came back with. They were less uncomfortable, I guess, without that last phase, but also. I haven't thought it all the way through.
We'll talk to John about that.
Okay.
I'd like some clarity on what it,
Understand
yeah.
what that does by keeping it, what it does by striking.
Yeah.
Michael?
I mean, I think what that does is, this is just my opinion, and I guess we could just wait for John, but I think what it does is, in that initial stage, you're not building residence for short-term rentals. You're building it for, or not resident, you're building housing for housing, primary housing. You're not building it for the person in New York that wants to have a pretty little house in Vermont, but not willing to pay, income tax in the state of Vermont. Which is the reason why we should have a different tax rate for those people. That would be what my thought is for that particular sentence. So if that's the case, then I would actually like to keep that in. Oh, sorry.
I would look forward to hearing from Ledge Council about the verb offer. Just strikes me as, I'd like to understand if that verb does what we're intending it to do. And I think a real estate lawyer who could tell us that. But second was, it seems like 4 we've actually unwittingly stumbled into how to create the missing middle. Like it seems the testimony we heard seemed to suggest that it would completely cap in the return on investment or something along those lines, or keep targets in a range that we'd said we really couldn't think of a way to do. Having said all that, I'm happy to make the modifications that we need to make in order to get across the finish line, because it seems like that matters more now. But if I could hear more about offer as providing all the coverage we need, then I'll feel good about that verb. And it seemed like we got rid of all that. There's habitability was a topic of conversation for us.
And we had the tiers.
Since that's all. All right, it was about improvements no longer have been unyoked from the minimum habitability. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm good.
Just to be clear, I'm okay with that proposal that you just made, that you talked about earlier, and in terms of just, if you just remove that last phrase, I still don't know what exclusively means.
Yeah.
I think that's, we can have that conversation, John. And, I think we need to talk with him. He wasn't here for the conversation we had with VLCT. Need to talk with him about that as well. So we'll do that when he's back. The other last piece, I think, is what Maura brought up on the 60% opposed to 40. And I think she makes a strong case to us going back to 60. But
I agree. I think that's compelling.
I'm not worried about it. We certainly need housing, and we don't have a commercial property crisis. There are properties all over the state. We do have housing filled to the brim and the storefronts are empty. I don't see this isn't going to curb development. I'm not worried about people wanting to. I can't fathom why a developer would want to develop their commercial when they're not going to be able to fill it before their residential. I think more often you're going to see in our current market, they're going to want to get the residential built, which will provide them with the cash flow to build the commercial.
I mean, I'm not a big fan of the 60%, but I'm not willing to fall on my sword for it. Especially if, and the reason why is I still get back to my downtown, where we have ordinances that require the first floor to be, whether or not there's, a need for it, but it's required to be retail or, no, it is retail in Berry City.
But depending on what you're looking at now in Berry, for how many storefronts are empty.
Oh, well, we got plenty.
And so, I would think municipalities will want to start looking at those zoning bylaws to see if they really make sense right now. And they may relax. I don't know, but I'm thinking they may be thinking about that as well, because it doesn't look good when you drive down Main Street and you have a bunch of vacant storefronts, and you have housing out above them.
I can tell you firsthand, we did that very thing in my planning commission. RPC said there's just not a lot of commercial. We actually relaxed our commercial requirements. So that's going on now. We did it, I think it was in 23. So.
And does it make sense that you have some buildings that are all residential on Main Street? That might encourage, more people to move into the empty storefronts that are there, because they have more people that are there to go to the stores.
Yeah, and we did an alternate in our situation of allowing a developer, instead of commercial, to do like amenities. So like a gym or a gaming room or something like that, something to add to the value, for the residents.
So on the 60 versus 40, I can see some, types of developments where something less than 60.
Right.
If that's the way we go, I think I'd like to talk to John about how to address that so that it in the board section, so that it's clear that the board has the authority to change that particular otherwise, requirement that was otherwise in place. Again, if it furthers the purposes of the program or whatever.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of the board, right? Is
Well,
to-
yeah.
So if it's not clear, then we want to make sure it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay. So, John?
I was thinking a little bit, I mean, we heard some testimony about a reluctance, having a very high threshold bar to clear for okaying things underneath any floor that we establish. I have some questions then about, we talk about deference to municipalities. Some structures make more sense for that approach than other structures, thinking about big old schools with big old auditoriums on the first floor and old armories and whatnot. And I would, as long as, and I'm not sure if this is where it's like time to let go and let the people the entities that will be having this conversation, let them have the conversation. And if that's the case, then we don't have to address it now. It's just something that it caught my ear as a forthright statement. And it did give me pause to think that the purpose of the chip board, I think I understand, is to evaluate with some sort of even-handedness about the potential for things that fall short. Okay. I think I'm all set.
Page 21 of the last version. It's the duties of the board.
Right. And
If you need more.
We need to beef it up, we can beef it up.
okay, maybe be a little more specific about what what they can do, notwithstanding the other provisions of that.
Think about it and hopefully we have John in an hour or so.
Can I mention one other issue? Talk about one other issue, and that is the effective date of when the program will be available for tier 2 areas. And I see that that is now in the draft as January 1, 2008.
28.
I'm sorry. I note that the way Act 181 is rolling out, tier 2 as well as tier 3, because you need tier 3 to know what's tier 2, will be effective on December 31st, 2006. So I think
The year.
so I'm not sure if the purpose of the delayed effect of including tier 2 in the program is to make sure you know what that area is.
That's one of the pieces.
Well, that's maybe where I need to hear it because
Yeah,
I-
so it's understanding what's coming out in the maps. So everybody has a good idea of.
Yeah.
But the second piece is to get better data on take of 1A, 1B. And to see and to understand what that's doing to the education fund.
yeah, I had a little bit of problem with that purpose, but
Many do,
surprise, yeah.
but those are the realities, so. And that, that date can be readjusted. In 2 years, next year. So, yeah, and none of that's written in stone, that could be adjusted so it doesn't happen till 2035. We don't know. So,
Seems to me the point of that is so they can get their tier 2 maps out and. If they're ahead of schedule, there's no reason we couldn't bring it back some.
well, you get number one, you get the maps out, but number two, you get some data back of what's going on, how the program is being received, how it's being utilized. Is it working? Is it not working? What do we need to do more? Maybe it is to start looking at tier 2 and getting them in earlier into the program. So those are all questions that have to be answered down the road.
And can I just add on this, the way the law is written right now, anything that isn't designated tier 1 or tier 3 is tier 2. And since nothing is designated tier 1 and tier 3 yet, everything currently is tier 2. So to push that date out is one of the guardrails that we have on where building is happening, because if tier 2 is available right now, then everywhere is available right now because nothing has been designated. And so there's so many pieces that we just have to get better information before we.
Yeah, and I hear you. I would just think, so we're talking about the way that it's set on the bill with a 2-year delay after, the lines. 2 years is a long time. So I'm not sure what information you're gonna get in 2 years that you can't get in 1. But I understand what you're talking about.
Isn't it December to January? So it's really
It's just
1 year.
1 year. December 26th, January 8th, it's just 1 year.
And it's my understanding that people have access to the CHIP program, if it's passed, through the interim Act 250, or Act 181, I should say. So it's not like the program can't be used.
Correct. There are lots of ways to access it.
Yeah, I get it. I was confusing the dates once again.
Dave?
Yeah, if I could weigh in here rather belatedly to some degree. Couple of thoughts. Real estate is a bundle of rights, and I thought that the VLCT testimony was rather compelling in the chilling effect that having that primary purpose for eternity could in fact have a chilling effect of both financing and on the resale market. So I'm all for making the adjustment to the language that we talked about there. On the other hand, the crisis is in providing housing, so I don't have that same concern about requiring a minimum threshold of 60%, which does still take away some of that bundle of rights. But in this case, it causes them to focus on an area that is very much market driven, or it can certainly be with a good program. My third issue is a question, and I know at least out on the floor, we're not supposed to ask a question we already know the answer to, but I would like to hear some more official discussion on this. What if a sponsor / developer comes forward with what he believes to be a good, solid proposal, and yet he can't come to complete agreement with the municipality? Is there any court of appeals, either the board or some other entity, to act as an intermediary and try and, if it can't make the initial agreement because of some issue one way or the other, is he just dead in the water? Or does she have some other place she can go to get that resolved?
So if a municipality doesn't want the infrastructure in their municipality, then the developer needs to find a different municipality.
Yeah. This is gonna be municipality driven. And so there's gonna be municipalities that aren't looking to grow.
Yeah,
There are some out there, and I don't think we're in a position to force them to take it on if they don't want it.
well, I'm just curious if there was some mechanism to, it may not be that they don't want the infrastructure, but they don't like the way the proposal goes about putting it in there or something. But I guess the developer can.
It could be in the wrong place that they don't want. That's where they can try to work with the developer. In the end, it's still there, it's the decision that has to be made between the two parties. And then,
We want the municipality to be in the driver's seat, I think, right? They're the ones who are maybe taking responsibility for the bond, maybe not, but they're the ones with the plan. They're the ones with the vision for their town. They're the ones who understand what the town can and can't support, with all of the different pieces, right? With the traffic, with the snow removal, with all of the things. So we want.
By the way, I thought the answer would be the developer would get to take their ball and their John Deere excavators and go home. So
Find another municipality.
Sophie's gonna come in at 3 o'clock to go through S-117 with us. Hopefully we can get that done. Somebody think about, who would like to be the one to report that, fill out. And, so
217?
170.
117, S-117. There you go with numbers again, Herb.
People in the hall, so
Yeah,
it's
so-
okay.
Let's take a break until 3, so let's be here at 3. Sophie comes in, we'll have a better idea when John will join us as well.